Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry, and today's story is one that I wish I never learned, but I did. So now here we are, because isn't that just how it goes, cult babes? I hear something awful and I want to tell you. Gotta get it out of my brain. We've got an absolute doozy of a case involving a socialite with a horrifying secret. An infamous psych ward in London, which we've actually visited in past episodes, and of course, we've got moidah. In 1972, Barbara Bakeland was found stabbed to death in her London apartment. The main suspect? Her only son. To know Barbara was to love her, at least according to some. To others, she was eccentric, and to some, an out-of-touch, vindictive bitch. On Cult Leader, I'm always looking for the why, because that's what fascinates us about learning about horrific crimes, right? While understandably the ethics of true crime are so often debated, I get it, but it's also in our human nature to want to understand tragedy. So let us first take a glimpse at Barbara's early life in order to get a better grasp on why things played out the way they did. It's rough. It all starts right back in the roaring 20s. That's right, baby. You know we love a trip back to the 20s. Before Barbara Bakeland was the tragic jet-set socialite we now associate with scandal and true crime lore, she was Barbara Daly. Born in Boston on September 28th of 1921, into a life that looked perfect from the outside, but was honestly a hot mess from the get. Barbara's dad died by suicide when she was just a kid, and after that, it was kind of all downhill from there. We don't know a ton about her father, Frank, but from what I gather, he was a traveling salesman, and it wasn't the most lucrative career. A far cry from the life that Barbara would later find herself entangled in, but we'll get to that later on. The family wasn't wealthy by any means, but at the time they were living fine, just fine. At least that's how it appeared from the outside looking in. In reality, Frank was pretty unhappy. It was in 1932, when Barbara was just 11 years old, that her father, Frank, took his own life in the garage attached to the family home by carbon monoxide poisoning. And it's unsure to this day what exactly was at the root of Frank's mental turmoil. Many have theorized that the onset of the Great Depression just did a number on his career. I mean, he was in sales, and he just couldn't hold his head above water anymore, and he just felt overall just like he was like a failure, and he thought this was his only option. After her father's death, Barbara and her mother Nina moved to New York. It was kind of like Nina tried to pretend their old life never happened. Not exactly the most healthy coping mechanism. She entirely rebranded. She became extremely focused on Barbara's looks and social potential, basically putting all of her energy that she could have been using to be like, hey, my daughter dealt with the horrific loss of her father. That's a huge burden to carry. Maybe we should focus on her mental health. No, no, no. Nina's putting all of her motherly energy into turning her daughter into a star, or at least marrying her off to someone important. That was something that was made very clear from a very young age for Barbara. After her father's death, Frank's name was rarely brought up in the home. There was no therapy, no grief counseling, no processing whatsoever, just bury it under lipstick and high society aspirations. And Nina did try and be a good mom. She was left to raise Barbara on her own, and she did everything she could to keep up appearances. But things behind closed doors were bleak. Like, we're talking a classic case of don't air our dirty laundry while the house is actively on fire. Nina became obsessed with projecting success and stability, even though her mental health was reportedly crumbling. It's like when your entire family is just fucking going at it, right? They're screaming at each other while you're trying to take a picture for the family Christmas card, and then the mom's like, smile, everyone, smile, so Aunt Diane knows how fucking happy we are. Newsflash, Aunt Diane. Tommy fucked the babysitter. Ashley's looking up two girls kissing on the family computer. Nothing is okay. You know what I'm saying? It really did fuck Barbara up, though. It's just that mindset. But unfortunately, that mindset is an all too common phenomenon where nothing else matters as long as other people think we're happy and having a good time. It's the Ruby Frankification of it all. It's the couple posting on Instagram that you know secretly hates each other. That kind of energy rubbed off hard on Barbara, and from a young age, she was taught that looks are everything. And if you had beauty, you could survive anything. So Barbara really leaned into that mentality. She became a model, she clawed and climbed her way through the New York social scene, and she even scored a cover on Harper's Bazaar. And Barbara was striking. Red hair, dramatic bone structure, the kind of woman who turned heads in every room she walked into. But behind the scenes, Barbara was also reportedly struggling with depression, paranoia, and a lot of anxiety. I mean, she had a lot of unresolved trauma. A classic walking contradiction, poised, polished, and deeply unstable, which is also how I like to describe myself, except without the poised and polished part. Just a little unstable, a little unwell. Anyway, so Nina, Barbara's mom, pushes her towards wealthy men and status, and Barbara learned early on that survival meant marrying up. That was everything. Which brings us to her husband. That changed everything and catapulted Barbara from a young gal pretending to have it all to literally having everything you could ask for and more. Enter Brooks Bakeland. He was handsome, sophisticated, and filthy rich, baby. We're talking old money, heir to the Bakelite fortune, which most of you have probably heard of, I would assume. The world's first synthetic plastic. The stuff your grandma's jewelry box and rotary phone were probably made of. And the family was a rolling in it. Brooks was their golden boy. He was tall, Ivy League, multilingual, basically just a walking trust fund with charm. The ideal candidate for someone like Barbara. Barbara and Brooks met in New York sometime in the early 1940s, and sparks flew immediately. She was striking and glamorous. She was a model with a tragic backstory and a thirst for the finer things. And Brooks was the perfect accessory to her fantasy life. She wanted out of her emotionally wrecked lower middle class past, and Brooks represented the fairy tale. He had it all: money, luxury, jet setting, security. She knew if she married him, she'd never have to worry again. She was wrong, but they still got married in 1942, and to the outside world, it looked like a storybook romance. But like everything in Barbara's life, it was all vibe, no foundation. From very early on, their relationship was rocky at best. Brooks was charming, yes, but he also reportedly had a very hard time keeping it in his pants, and he was very dismissive of Barbara's growing instability. I mean, also, unfortunately, common at the time, right? We've all seen Mad Men. Ladies, your husband wants a whiskey when he gets home from work. He doesn't want to hear why you're sad, okay? Keep it to yourself and don't go to therapy because nobody needs to know our problems. But Barbara, she was sad. She was dramatic, she was intense, and she was possessive, prone to emotional outbursts and deeply insecure, especially as she aged and felt her beauty, her only real currency, starting to fade. That's really what I think personally fast tracked Barbara towards insanity. And honestly, it's relatable because if you've ever slept like shit, and then looked in the mirror and suddenly everything's worse, you're like, oh, cool. I aged 100 years overnight. I look like I've never taken a sip of water in my actual life. I was telling my boyfriend or my fiance, the champ, the other day, we were going through photos and one I looked hot and one I looked ugly. And I said, I'm so sorry to tell you, sometimes I'm hot, sometimes I'm ugly. And that is just life, baby. But anyway, back to Barb and Brooks. It wasn't all bad for the couple. I mean, eventually it was, but there were bouts of happiness in between the bouts of melancholy. Real quick though, I want to take a little detour into the Bakeland family tree because these people, they were not your average rich folks. I mean, they're plastics royalty. Do you know how much fucking plastic we consume? As we know, royalty tends to come with secrets, scandals, and absolutely no grip on reality, and I'm living for that, okay? The family's fortune came from Leo Bakeland, Brooks's grandfather. He was a Belgian chemist who invented Bakelite back in 1907. You've definitely seen it before, as I mentioned, like they used to use it in rotary phones, radios, jewelry, kitchenware. It was heat resistant, durable, and honestly kind of chic, okay? I know, plastic bad, but listen, it was a different time. It changed the world, and it made Leo and his descendants obscenely rich. But with great fortune often comes weird vibes, right? And it's one of my favorite things, honestly. Nothing gets me going like an over-the-top wealthy family dynasty because there's always just fucked up stories. Like Army Hammer vibes, you know what I'm saying? Honestly, probably the least exciting of them all. Like, show me the DuPont dirt, you know? I want to do a deep dive on that family eventually. But my obsession really began with the Bouviers and Jackie Kennedy's wacky extended family because if you haven't watched Grey Gardens, how are you even real? You haven't lived until you have seen it. Actually, funny enough, when I was reading about Barbara Baekeland for the first time, I was like, oh my God, I could picture Jessica Lange playing her in her fading years. For those who don't know, Grey Gardens is a documentary about an eccentric mother daughter duo, Big Edie and Little Edie. And it's just iconic. Watch if you haven't, watch again if you have, because nothing hits like that movie. But they made a movie remake of the documentary where Drew Barrymore plays Little Edie and Jessica Lange plays Big Edie. So, full circle, he's making sense, people, some way, somehow. But I think that would be a good cast. There was a movie made about this story that I'm talking about today, but we'll get into that later on. We got to talk about the Bakelands. They were like the epitome of aristocracy, intellectuals with very high opinions of themselves and very little emotional intelligence. Like, you feel like they would be friends with the Gilmores, okay? Think dinner parties full of passive aggressive comments, bookshelves full of unread philosophy, and a deep fear of mediocrity. Above all else, Brooks, being Leo's grandson, grew up in this world of privilege, expectations, and pressure. He was essentially groomed to be this cultured, worldly man who was fluent in multiple languages, well traveled, with just enough charm to coast on without ever really having to do anything, like one of the OG Nepo babies. He didn't invent anything. He didn't work a real job. His entire persona was just kind of built on being the heir to invention. But in addition to money, he inherited a sense of superiority and a deep emotional vacancy. Also common if you've ever met somebody like Brooks in your life. Now, Barbara, of course, didn't come from that world at all, which made her both fascinating and threatening to the Bakeland clan. She wasn't born into it. She performed it, and even when she married into the family, she was never truly accepted. Brooks's relatives reportedly saw her as unstable, vulgar, and just too much, which, let's be honest, just makes me love her even more. Right now. I'm not going to love her so much later, okay? And that is called foreshadowing. This was a family where everything looked really good on paper. They had the wealth, they had the prestige, the legacy, but underneath it was rotting from the inside out. There was mental illness, rumored substance abuse, emotional neglect, and a general don't talk about it policy when it came to anything uncomfortable. And this will be a super important fact to remember later on in the story. So, as I mentioned, in 1942, Brooks and Barbara got married. Their wedding wasn't royal wedding level public, but it was definitely a high society affair. Friends described it as glamorous, classy, and a bit performative, which is kind of the theme of their whole marriage. It had that old school NYC elitism to it, and Barbara, of course, was obsessed with appearances. She wanted it to be the kind of wedding you read about in Town and Country, because for her, this wasn't just a marriage, it was a rebirth. A chance to leave behind the poor, tragic girl from Boston and become someone important. Because what makes you important? Money. Now, 4 years into their marriage, in 1946, the couple had their one and only child, Anthony Tony Bakeland. And if the marriage was already hanging on by a thread, Tony was the needle pulling it tighter and tighter until it snapped. Lest we forget, nothing fixes a bad marriage like having a baby. Barbara shifted all of her attention onto Tony, like all of it, and Brooks slowly started to detach. He spent more and more time away from home, and then he moved out altogether. As Tony grew up, he knew he felt different from the other kids. He slowly came to the realization that he was, in fact, gay. But in the Bakeland family, this was not something to be celebrated. With the amount of homophobia that still exists in our modern society, you can only imagine that in the 1950s and 1960s, coming out of the closet was not welcomed with a hug or, "You're so brave." Add to that the Bakeland family name, the legacy. I mean, he was obviously one day going to be inheriting his father's estate. So to them, it was just not a good look for one of their heirs. But nobody, and I mean nobody, would go to more extreme lengths to quote unquote cure Tony's sexuality than his own mother. Barbara was so fucking desperate. That's really what comes to mind when I think of her. Her entire life, she was so desperate to fit in, to have the ideal nuclear family. And part of this, she couldn't help, right? It was how she was conditioned. What would people say if they found out that her son was a homosexual? It was a ghastly thought to Barbara. Surely something that could outcast them from the high society circles that she'd snaked her way into. So instead of worrying about the fact that, oh, I don't know, her husband was fucking a girl that went to school with Tony, yeah, a girl her son's age, she honed in on Tony's sexuality because it was her mission to fix him. Now, pause really quick. I want to zoom out for a second because there's a few different scenarios that play out depending on the source. Some say that Brooks had moved to Europe with a younger woman, potentially one of Tony's friends, and that Barbara ended up eventually following him over there. Some say she uprooted with Tony and it was the two of them that moved over there after Brooks had already been out of the picture. But regardless, what we do know is that in the 1960s, Barbara was officially divorced and she and Tony were living in a beautiful home in Cadogan Square, which, just FYI, an average home there goes for about $6 million today. So this is like the place to be. And Tony, at this point, when they were moving, he was in his 20s, and the dynamic between the two of them was odd. Picture like a sleek London flat in the heart of Chelsea. There's old paintings on the wall, a cocktail cart in the corner, and chandeliers dripping above the carnage of a broken family life. As seems to be the common theme here, from the outside, it still had that faint gloss of wealth, of excess, but inside, it was a pressure cooker, ready to explode at any moment. From what I've gathered, as soon as Brooks was out of the picture, her grasp onto Tony grew stronger. She didn't want to lose another man in her life. She was like the ultimate helicopter mom. And again, her main priority was trying to solve the whole gay thing. And she took to some pretty fucked up extremes, including hiring sex workers to try and flip him, which is wild. But I've also heard stories before of parents trying to do the same thing, like, you know, that'll do it. They'll just fuck the gay right out of him. As outlandish as it is, it's equally as sad to think about how that would make somebody feel. Tony had been raised in this fucked up upper echelon environment where he was already under immense pressure to uphold the family name. So that alone is a lot to handle, but that coupled with the fact that he couldn't even be who he truly felt like he was, it just created a recipe for disaster. Despite their disturbing private life, Barbara still tried to maintain her socialite persona. Long after Brooks was out of the picture, she was always seen at elite parties, clinging to the faded glamour of her younger days. But even the jet-set crowd began to distance themselves. People whispered, they side-eyed, and slowly stepped away. With Brooks out of the picture, there just wasn't as much appeal. She wasn't chic anymore. She was becoming that woman, the tragic one with a glass of white wine in one hand and a barely veiled breakdown in the other. The kind you could just picture going into the bathroom and slamming her hand on the counter and going, damn it to hell. Meanwhile, Tony's behavior was growing more erratic as well. He was drinking a lot, he was using drugs, lashing out, and at one point even stabbed a man in Morocco during a psychotic episode. It was clear he was spiraling down a very deadly path, but Barbara refused to let anyone else step in. She owned Tony, in her opinion, and no one was going to take him from her. That's a fucking Lifetime movie mom if I've ever seen one. So now we have to get to like, it's about to get fucking wild. And when I tell you wild, wild. So in addition to hiring sex workers to fuck her son into heterosexuality, she had him in therapy, okay? That's progress, right? And the therapists were like, your son needs to be committed, ma'am. But she was obviously not having it. She's like, not my baby. He's fine. The truth is, both of them were holding on to a secret so ghastly that nobody could believe. And you guys, it's fucked. Barbara apparently had raped her son several times, trying to get him to be attracted to women. Can you even? Like, I don't know much about parenting. I cannot see a world where a mother raping their son is going to be a solution to anything. Yeah, not a single thing comes to mind. No wonder he was so fucked up. I mean, God. So he's going to therapy, right? And he's seeing a psychiatrist. And at some point in 1972, the psychiatrist tells Barbara, like, I do not think you should be alone with Tony. Which, knowing what we know now, is obvious. But, like, he was basically telling Barbara, this psychiatrist, that she was in danger. But she refused to believe that Tony would ever do anything to hurt her. But boy, was she wrong. He had already tried to attack her at this point. He'd attacked other people. He'd stabbed someone. He even got committed at one point, which Barbara pleaded for his release into her care because She just couldn't live without him. Things had gotten extremely volatile at home. Tony would absolutely lose it in fits of rage because he had just built so much understandable resentment towards his mother. Doors were slammed, drinks were thrown, glasses smashed. But in classic Barbara fashion, she brushed it all off to outsiders, even her close friends. She told her friends and family everything was fine. Oh, we're great. We're really working on things. It's not great. It's not great. Cut to November 17th, 1972, a day which would prove things were, in fact, not fine at all. The day had started out relatively calm. No big blowouts, no fight. Barbara cooked Tony some lunch that afternoon, but at some point, Tony snapped. He went into the kitchen, picked out a kitchen knife, and proceeded to walk into the living room and brutally stab his mother to death. One of the stab wounds was a fatal stab to the heart. In Barbara's eyes, it was the ultimate betrayal. To Tony, it was putting an end to the person who he'd felt was responsible for ruining his life. After murdering his mother, Tony calls a friend, calmly confessing, "I killed Barbara. I should probably call the police." He did. When the police arrived, it was a very eerie scene, to say the least. Tony didn't seem disturbed by his mother's bloody corpse. In fact, police claimed he was ordering Chinese food when they arrived. He seemed calm, cool, collected. He was taken into custody without a fight and later charged with manslaughter. They deemed him mentally incompetent, and as a result, he was sent to the infamous Broadmoor Asylum, which we have an entire episode on. Highly suggest listening. It's probably one of my favorites. And at Broadmoor, Tony thrived. He was painting again, a hobby he'd lost at some point during his descent into madness. He was friendly with the other patients and hospital employees, and as a result, 8 years after being admitted, Tony's doctor said, "You know what? Let's let this guy go." So in 1980, at the age of 34, Tony was released. However, he was not welcome to stay in the UK. They were like, "You've done enough here." So he had to return to America. That was part of the deal with his release. But let me tell you, this was a shit show. Days, yes, days, after being released into the care of his grandmother in the US, Tony ended up stabbing her as well. And this time, he wasn't going to be painting in a hospital. He was sent to Rikers prison to await trial. Anytime I bring up Rikers, I automatically think about Law and Order SVU. Like I hear the doom doom. I stumbled across an article from the Reading Evening Post from Thursday, July 31st, 1980. I want to read that to you really quick. It says, top psychiatrist blames security hospital. Quote, an eminent American psychiatrist has attacked Broadmoor Hospital after a freed killer was dumped on his doorstep. The claims come after Tony Bakeland allegedly stabbed his grandmother days after being released from Broadmoor. 8 years ago, he killed his mother in exactly the same way. Now, the killer's uncle, Dr. Frederick Bakeland, who was a professor of psychiatry at New York State University, claims he warned the Special Berkshire Hospital of the danger from his nephew. And he said he spotted the killer instinct in him even before he stabbed his mother to death 8 years ago. Dr. Bakeland alleges, Tony Bakeland was just dumped on a plane to America without enough preparation being made for further treatment. Nobody spotted just how dangerous he was, even though the warning signs were there. Important letters from Dr. Bakeland were not answered. Tony Bakeland was shown letters he should not have seen. The American doctor said he was asked by Broadmoor to keep an eye on his nephew when he arrived in America, but he found out he had arrived there the day after landing. And when 33-year-old Tony Bakeland did land, he had no money. He arrived without a penny, said his uncle. Dr. Bakeland said he wrote to Broadmoor before Tony's release asking for details of his condition, but never received a reply. He claimed Tony was shown the letter. That's totally unacceptable, especially with a paranoid patient, said the doctor. True, he's right. Dr. Bakeland, he's bringing the facts. Dr. Bakeland claimed the hospital should have spotted how ill his nephew was by the letters he was writing to relatives. If a man off the street had read those, he would have called them crazy, he said. The doctor claimed Tony found himself in a situation exactly like the one which triggered him to kill his mother. He was being nagged by his grandmother just as his mother nagged him, and something snapped. His grandmother had begged that he be freed from Broadmoor, but Dr. Bakeland wanted Broadmoor to promise that a halfway hospital for people getting used to freedom would set up for him. The promise was made, but the halfway hospital was not properly arranged, he claimed. Dr. Edgar Udwin, the acting medical head of Broadmoor, would not comment on the allegations yesterday. The Home Office said Tony Bakeland was making his way to a halfway house with the correct papers. A spokesman admitted no place had been found for him in one. All the other allegations are the responsibility of the Department of Health and Social Security, he said. The DHSS said today it would not comment on the allegations to the press, but anybody was free to complain and grievances would be looked at. Basically, fuck off. Tony Bakeland is expected to stand trial in America next month, charged with unpremeditated attempted murder. His grandmother is recovering in a New York hospital. He was sent to Broadmoor by an Old Bailey judge after he admitted to killing his mother. The judge accepted it was manslaughter. So, grandmother survives, which is the good news, but there would be no trial. On March 20th, 1981, just shy of 35 years old, Tony Bakeland died by suicide in his cell at Rikers. Reports say that he suffocated himself with a plastic bag. A slow, tragic end to a life shaped entirely by control, trauma, and generational madness on both sides. A tragic tale of a mother's love gone too far. It's sad to think that it's just literally the environment that he was born into. If you want to know more about the story, there is a movie starring Julianne Moore as Barbara called Savage Grace that came out in 2007. But this is really interesting. So I was reading the Wikipedia page about Barbara Bakeland. I know, deep research, okay? But after the film came out, I guess Barbara's former lover, Samuel Adams Green, he was friends with like the whole Warhol crew, all of that. But I guess he wrote an article pointing out that there were elements in the film that could be potentially misleading for those trying to read back to the reality inspiring it. He referred to, in particular, a scene where there's like a menage a trois, okay? A little threesome, which depicted Barbara, Sam, the guy writing this article, and Barbara's son Tony in bed together having sex. And he said, "It's true that almost 40 years ago I had an affair with Barbara, but I certainly never slept with her son, nor am I bisexual. She started telling people she had an incestuous relationship with her son as a way of curing him of homosexuality. But I don't think she had sex with Tony. I think she simply enjoyed shocking people." That still ain't right. It doesn't sit right. Even if she was just saying it to shock people, that is so fucking crazy. I mean, essentially, picture a dad saying that, yeah, I fucked the gay out of my daughter. Like what? It's fucked. The whole thing's fucked. They're all insane. It's crazy, and it proves that no matter how much money you have, problems can and will still pop up. So that is the wild true story of the Bakelands, and that's it for the week. I will see you next time, and until next time, you can't control your children's lives, and if you go too far, you might get a knife. Goodbye.